In September 2010, she walked onto the MTV Video Music Awards stage wearing a dress made of raw meat, and within 24 hours, her name dominated headlines in more than 50 countries. By then, she had already sold millions of records. 9 years later, in 2019, she stood at the Academy Awards and won Best Original Song in front of nearly 30 million viewers worldwide. From global outrage to a gold statue, was she chasing shock for attention or forcing the world to listen? By 2011, she was no longer just a headline. She was a movement. Her second studio album, Born This Way, debuted at #1 in more than 20 countries. In the United States alone, it sold over 1 million copies in its first week. The title track became an anthem for millions who had never heard themselves reflected in mainstream pop before. She didn't stop at music. She publicly opposed the U.S. military's don't ask, don't tell policy. She spoke at rallies. She framed pop concerts as safe spaces. She built an identity around radical self-acceptance, not quietly, but at stadium scale. At the peak of her fame, she had already won multiple Grammy Awards and was grossing hundreds of millions from global tours. Yet even at this altitude, critics insisted the spectacle was the point. The outfits, the shock, the controversy. But what if the spectacle was only the doorway? Because behind the headlines and viral images was something more calculated, a strategy to turn attention into influence. She didn't just sell records. She sold a message. The question was never whether Lady Gaga could dominate culture. The question was whether culture would eventually understand what she was actually trying to say. Before the meat dress, before the anthems, before the stadiums chanting her name. There was Stefani Germanotta, born March 28, 1986 in Manhattan, New York. She grew up in a middle-class Italian-American family on the Upper West Side. Her father worked in internet entrepreneurship. Her mother had a corporate background. The household was structured, disciplined, Catholic. Achievement was expected. Presentation mattered. Reputation mattered. At 4 years old, she began playing piano by ear, not because she was told to perform, but because she wanted control. By 13, she had written her first ballad. By 14, she was performing at open mic nights in downtown Manhattan, navigating rooms filled with adults twice her age. Music became both refuge and proof that she was not invisible. She attended Convent of the Sacred Heart, a private all-girls Catholic school. The uniforms were strict. The social hierarchies were subtle but sharp. She stood out, dramatic, ambitious, open about wanting to be famous. In teenage ecosystems, bold self-belief can trigger resistance. She was teased, labeled weird. There were online mockeries. One Facebook group reportedly read, "Stefani Germanotta, you will never be famous." She saw it. Rejection at that age does not disappear. It embeds. It creates a heightened sensitivity to exclusion. It builds a hunger not only for success, but for validation at scale. If a small circle refuses to see you, the instinct becomes clear. Build a stage large enough that no one can ignore you again. By 17, she earned early admission to NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. It was recognition of talent. But inside elite artistic environments, comparison intensifies. Everyone is gifted. Everyone wants the spotlight. 2 years later, she made a decisive move. She dropped out, not because she lacked ability, but because she refused to wait for permission. She moved into a modest apartment on the Lower East Side. The environment shifted from Catholic order to downtown experimentation. She performed in burlesque-inspired shows. She explored sexuality and image as performance tools. She studied how audiences react. She learned that discomfort generates attention, and attention generates leverage. Around 19, she experienced a traumatic sexual assault, an event she would speak about publicly years later. At the time, it was not processed openly. It was absorbed. Trauma reshapes identity quietly. It alters the relationship between body and safety. It sharpens the need for control. It can also deepen empathy for others who feel powerless. In this period, 2 psychological threads formed simultaneously. The first was ambition. The second was advocacy. Having felt exclusion, she gravitated toward themes of belonging. Having experienced violation, she developed sensitivity to vulnerability in others. These threads would later define her public voice. Music remained a constant. When she played piano, she commanded emotional space. When she sang, rooms shifted. But she also noticed something else. Subtlety was often ignored. Extremity was remembered. In crowded cultural landscapes, moderate voices fade. Loud ones echo. The young woman who once felt dismissed began to understand mechanics of visibility. If you cannot blend in comfortably, you can choose to stand out deliberately. If you cannot control how people judge you, you can control what they see first. This foundation did not create Lady Gaga yet, but it made her possible. The sensitivity, the rejection, the early ambition, the trauma, the hunger to be heard, the refusal to shrink. All of it laid the groundwork for a persona that would not ask for attention politely, but demand it at full volume. By the time the name Lady Gaga would emerge, the intention behind it was already forming. She did not want to be quietly talented. She wanted to be culturally undeniable. The question was not whether she would speak loudly. It was how loud she was willing to become, and what would cost to sustain that volume. In 2006, at just 20 years old, she signed her first professional contract with Def Jam Recordings. It seemed like confirmation that the ambition was justified. 3 months later, she was dropped. No album released. No explanation that softened the blow. Just a quiet removal from the roster. For someone who had already left university and bet everything on music, the message was unmistakable. Talent alone was not enough, and Stefani Germanotta was not yet compelling enough for the machine. Instead of retreating, she recalculated. She began writing songs for other artists under Interscope, behind the scenes, invisible again. She contributed hooks, lyrics, melodies. She studied the architecture of pop, how choruses are engineered, how radio repetition works, how branding amplifies a sound. She learned how to build a hit from the inside out. But something was missing. Writing for others gave her income and industry proximity, yet it did not give her presence. The hunger to be seen did not diminish. It sharpened. Around this period, she met producer Rob Fusari. During studio sessions, he compared her vocal style to Freddie Mercury. While experimenting with Queen's Radio GAGA, the nickname emerged almost playfully, Lady Gaga. It sounded theatrical, exaggerated, artificial. She kept it. The name was not random. It created distance. Stefani was a young woman with insecurities and history. Lady Gaga sounded larger than biography. It sounded constructed, performative, strategic. She began building the image intentionally. Sculpted wigs, sharp silhouettes, unconventional makeup. The goal was not elegance. It was memorability. In a rapidly accelerating digital culture, neutrality disappears. Shock remains searchable. She performed relentlessly in New York clubs in 2007 and 2008. Small venues, inconsistent crowds. She tested boundaries. Some nights she leaned into glam rock, other nights into performance art. She watched how people reacted when she exaggerated gestures, when she distorted her voice, when she leaned into theatrical absurdity. Reaction meant engagement. Engagement meant relevance. This was not chaos. It was research. By the time Just Dance was released in 2008, she had refined the formula. The track did not explode instantly. It climbed gradually, driven by club rotations and radio spins. When it finally reached #1 in multiple countries, it felt less like luck and more like confirmation that the strategy worked. The album to fame followed, and the persona solidified. Interviews were delivered with deliberate eccentricity. Public appearances escalated visually. The line between sincerity and satire blurred on purpose. She was not simply singing pop songs. She was staging identity as spectacle. Critics began labeling her a shock artist. She did not reject the label. She weaponized it. If controversy guaranteed coverage, coverage guaranteed a platform. And a platform could carry more than music. Behind the visuals was calculation rooted in experience. She understood what it felt like to be overlooked. She understood how quickly online narratives form. She chose to preempt them by creating imagery so bold that it controlled the conversation. But there was also risk. When a persona becomes a public interface, it must constantly evolve. Each appearance needs to escalate, or at least sustain intensity. Subtlety becomes invisible. Moderation becomes forgettable. As Poker Face dominated charts in 2009, selling millions globally, the experiment had turned into dominance. Yet with each headline, the distinction between strategy and self blurred further. Lady Gaga was no longer just a stage name. It was a brand, a movement, an expectation. She had chosen the path deliberately, not private in secrecy, but private in origin. The decision to amplify herself was born from personal history, not just marketing ambition. What the world saw as outrageous fashion was, in her mind, armor and megaphone combined. The foundation was complete. She had built a character powerful enough to command attention on a global scale. The question that lingered beneath the success was simple but dangerous. Once you teach the world to expect spectacle from you, can you ever return to being quiet without disappearing? By 2009, Lady Gaga was no longer emerging. She was dominating. Just Dance had already reached #1 in multiple countries. Poker Face followed and became one of the best-selling singles of the year, eventually moving over 14 million copies worldwide. Within 12 months, she had gone from club performer to global headline. The famed monster expanded that dominance. Bad Romance debuted near the top of charts across Europe and North America. The music video amassed hundreds of millions of views, becoming one of the most watched clips online at the time. Every frame was designed, every movement intentional. Fashion houses began studying her. Magazines began orbiting her. Then came 2010. At the MTV Video Music Awards, she appeared in a dress constructed from raw meat. Within hours, the image circulated globally. News outlets debated symbolism. Animal rights groups responded. Fashion critics reacted. Social media amplified it. In less than 24 hours, she had once again redefined the news cycle. To some, it was absurd spectacle. To others, it was commentary on policy, identity, and the objectification of bodies. What mattered most was that the world was looking. In 2011, Born This Way debuted at #1 in more than 20 countries. In the United States, it sold over 1 million copies in its first week. The title track became an anthem for LGBTQ+ communities worldwide. Stadium tours followed. The Born This Way ball ultimately sold over 1.7 million tickets before an abrupt cancellation years later. She was not only selling music, she was selling ideology. You were born this way. The phrase moved beyond pop lyrics into cultural language. Teenagers wrote it on posters. Fans tattooed it on skin. Concert arenas became spaces of collective affirmation. Yet, visibility at that scale alters perception. Critics accused her of manipulation. They argued the controversy was engineered. They suggested the activism was branding. The louder she spoke, the more polarized reactions became. At the peak, she was earning tens of millions annually. She had already won multiple Grammy Awards. She was appearing at political events and public rallies. She was speaking about don't ask, don't tell, while also topping charts. The paradox intensified. Was she an activist who used pop as a vehicle, or a pop star who used activism as amplification? From the outside, the energy seemed inexhaustible. Each award show delivered another dramatic entrance. Each album cycle delivered another aesthetic reinvention. The machine appeared synchronized: music, fashion, controversy, commentary. But spectacle requires stamina. Shock demands escalation. When attention becomes a currency, the exchange rate grows harsher each cycle. The more the audience expects transformation, the less tolerance there is for stillness. Behind the scenes, the calendar tightened. International travel blurred time zones. Interviews stacked without pause. Performance rehearsals extended into early mornings. Even advocacy required emotional labor. Representing marginalized communities is not symbolic alone. It is responsibility. The character that once guaranteed visibility now required constant maintenance. Lady Gaga could not simply appear. She had to arrive. And as the spotlight intensified, the margin for error narrowed. The same media that amplified her could pivot quickly. Praise and dismissal often occupied adjacent headlines. At this height, she seemed untouchable. Cultural dominance, commercial success, social influence. Yet the very elements that built her platform, shock, scale, spectacle, created a pressure system with no easy exit. Because when the world becomes accustomed to you speaking loudly, it does not immediately notice when your voice begins to strain. The peak was undeniable. The spotlight was absolute. The question that quietly formed beneath the applause was not whether she had conquered culture. It was whether culture would allow her to evolve beyond the role it had assigned her. In early 2013, the momentum fractured. The Born This Way ball had already sold more than 1.7 million tickets and grossed over $160 million worldwide. Then, at 27 years old, she announced the remaining tour dates were canceled. A severe labral tear in her right hip required immediate surgery. The image of unstoppable performance collided with medical limitation. For the first time since her rise, Lady Gaga was physically still. No choreography, no dramatic entrances, no arena-sized affirmation, just recovery, pain management, and silence. Later, she would reveal that the injury was compounded by chronic pain related to fibromyalgia, nerve sensitivity, exhaustion, inflammation that did not fade with applause. The cancellation did more than pause a tour. It disrupted the narrative of invincibility. At the peak of commercial power, the body had forced interruption. Spectacle met biology, and biology did not negotiate. While she healed, expectations did not diminish. The industry rarely allows extended quiet. Artpop was released in November 2013. Framed as experimental and confrontational, it debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. Yet compared to previous releases, sales momentum slowed more quickly. Critical reception was divided. Some praised ambition. Others labeled it excessive. Media tone shifted subtly. Headlines questioned whether the shock formula had reached saturation. Commentators asked if she had overplayed spectacle. In pop culture, dominance is celebrated. Perceived overreach is punished. For an artist whose platform was built on intensity, even slight deceleration felt amplified. The same channels that once amplified her rebellion now analyzed her decline. Internally, the pressure multiplied. Shock, once a voluntary strategy, had become expectation. Each era required escalation. Each appearance required reinvention. When reinvention becomes routine, authenticity strains. At the same time, unresolved trauma resurfaced. Years after the sexual assault she experienced at 19, symptoms of post-traumatic stress intensified. She later spoke publicly about PTSD, describing flashbacks, anxiety, and emotional dissociation. Trauma does not respond to career success. It operates independently of awards and chart positions. Chronic pain complicated recovery further. Fibromyalgia flare-ups could immobilize her. Fatigue altered rehearsals. The body that once powered high-intensity tours now signaled limits. In an industry that equates endurance with value, limitation feels threatening. Publicly, she maintained composure. Interviews remained articulate. Performances remained controlled. Privately, she described periods of depression and isolation. She questioned whether the world valued her voice or merely her spectacle. There is a specific strain that comes from embodying symbolism. She had become a cultural figure for marginalized communities. That role carried weight. Representation demands consistency. When millions attach hope to you, vulnerability feels dangerous. At times, she expressed anger at the industry, at expectations, at herself. Ambition had propelled her forward. Yet ambition had also created velocity that was difficult to sustain. The persona that once shielded her from rejection now risked overshadowing her human needs. In 2014, she collaborated with Tony Bennett on Cheek to Cheek, a jazz album that diverged sharply from electronic pop. The project was stripped down, vocally centered, and rooted in classic standards. It won a Grammy. More importantly, it grounded her. Singing without theatrical armor allowed space for breath. Yet grounding projects did not immediately dissolve internal conflict. The calendar still demanded output. Interviews still required composure. Social media still amplified every gesture. Recovery, both physical and psychological, was nonlinear. The central tension sharpened. Lady Gaga, the symbol, versus Stefani, the person. The symbol required boldness. The person required rest. The symbol thrived on spectacle. The person sought integration. In later interviews, she admitted that at certain points she felt like a product rather than a human being. Image circulated faster than emotion. Public narrative often ignored internal cost. By 2016, she began speaking more openly about trauma and chronic pain. She framed vulnerability not as weakness, but as reality. That shift was strategic and sincere. If shock had opened doors, honesty might redefine the conversation. However, transparency carries risk. Pop culture does not always reward nuance. When a figure known for flamboyance speaks softly about suffering, audiences must recalibrate. Some did, some resisted. The collapse was not a single dramatic breakdown. It was cumulative. Physical injury, commercial pressure, psychological strain, media volatility, the intersection of activism and entertainment. Each layer added weight. The cancellation of a $160 million tour at 27 symbolized more than surgery. It symbolized a moment when the body refused to sustain the mythology, when biology interrupted branding. The question beneath the headlines shifted. It was no longer whether she could generate controversy. It was whether she could survive the identity that controversy created. For years, spectacle had been the weapon. Now survival required recalibration. The dark side of cultural dominance was not hatred. It was expectation without pause. The world had applauded the symbol. The person was left negotiating the aftermath. The internal collapse did not erase her career. It exposed its cost. And exposure, unlike spectacle, cannot be easily styled or choreographed. The shift did not arrive with spectacle. It arrived with subtraction. In 2016, she released Joanne, named after her aunt who died at 19 from lupus. The production was restrained. Acoustic textures replaced electronic maximalism. The visuals were softer. A pink hat instead of metallic armor. The posture changed. Less confrontation, more confession. Commercially, it did not replicate the explosive dominance of Born This Way, but the intent was different. Joanne was not escalation. It was recalibration. She was no longer trying to shock culture into attention. She was inviting culture to listen. Then came 2018, and A Star Is Born. The role of ally required vulnerability, without exaggeration. Director and co-star Bradley Cooper insisted on minimal makeup for key scenes. Close-ups lingered. No distraction. No costume theatrics. Just expression. The transformation was subtle but radical. For the first time in years, the camera did not need spectacle to frame her. It trusted stillness. Shallow became the emotional anchor of the film. When it was released, it climbed charts globally. In February 2019, it won the Academy Award for Best Original Song. On Oscar night, nearly 30 million viewers watched the ceremony live. She wore a simple black gown. No architectural fashion statement. No shock narrative. When she sang, the camera moved closer. The moment was intimate, almost restrained. This was not the Lady Gaga of meat dresses and viral headlines. This was an artist allowing fragility to hold the spotlight. The victory mattered, but not only because of the gold statue. It signaled validation beyond spectacle. She was recognized not for controversy, but for craft. Not for escalation, but for emotional precision. The persona did not disappear. It integrated. In interviews after the film's success, she spoke openly about therapy, PTSD, and chronic pain. She described learning to live with discomfort instead of masking it. The language shifted from defiance to reflection. The rebirth was not explosive. It was structural. Shock was no longer the entry point. Authenticity was. She continued exploring projects that required emotional depth rather than visual extremity. Jazz collaborations returned. Acting expanded. Public appearances balanced confidence with candor. The most significant change was internal. She no longer needed to outpace criticism with spectacle. She could withstand it with stability. Cultural perception adjusted. The same outlets that once debated whether she was excessive now framed her as multidimensional. The narrative matured because she allowed it to. Rebirth in pop culture often means reinvention of image. This rebirth meant reintegration of identity. The symbol and the person began to align more closely. Lady Gaga was no longer armor against rejection. She became a vehicle for expression that did not erase Stefani. The question that once dominated headlines, is she doing this for attention, gradually lost urgency. The conversation shifted toward artistry, mental health, and longevity. She did not abandon the boldness that built her platform. She contextualized it. The turning point was not a louder entrance. It was a quieter presence that held equal power. And in an industry addicted to noise, choosing restraint could be the boldest move of all. After the Oscar moment passed and the headline settled, what remained was not spectacle, but recalibration. She did not retreat from pop. She redefined her relationship with it. In 2020, she released Chromatica, a return to high-energy dance production. On the surface, it echoed her earlier electronic dominance. Beneath the surface, the lyrics centered on trauma, healing, and emotional survival. The album debuted at #1 in multiple countries. Rain on Me, her collaboration with Ariana Grande, won a Grammy Award. Commercial power remained intact. The difference was intention. She no longer used shock as the primary doorway. The music carried vulnerability openly. Pain was not hidden behind costumes. It was integrated into the narrative. Interviews focused on therapy, resilience, and mental health awareness. Discussions about fibromyalgia and PTSD became normalized rather than sensationalized. The Born This Way Foundation, co-founded with her mother, expanded its work around youth mental health and kindness initiatives. What once sounded like a slogan matured into infrastructure. Her influence moved beyond charts into advocacy spaces, education, and public discourse. Culturally, her early extremity began to be reassessed. Younger artists cited her as permission to exist outside binary presentation. Queer performers referenced her as proof that mainstream success and identity activism were not mutually exclusive. The meat dress, once mocked, became archived as pop history rather than punchline. She continued acting, taking on roles that required psychological immersion rather than visual exaggeration. The public began to separate shock from substance, recognizing that the spectacle had always carried intent. Longevity in pop music is rare. Longevity after controversy is rarer. She sustained both. The key was transition, from reaction to reflection, from escalation to integration. Her legacy is not limited to awards or sales numbers, though they remain substantial. It includes a shift in how pop culture discusses identity, trauma, and self-expression. She proved that a performer could be theatrical and politically engaged, commercially dominant and emotionally transparent. Shock opened the door. Substance kept it open. The young woman once dismissed as excessive built a career that now spans more than 15 years across music, film, and advocacy. The narrative arc moved from outrage to recognition. What endures is not the controversy itself, but the expansion of space she created. For difference, for vulnerability, for evolution without disappearance. In 2010, the world saw a dress made of raw meat and called it absurd. In 2019, the same world watched her hold an Oscar and called it art. The distance between those two moments defines the story. Lady Gaga was once framed as spectacle first, substance second. Yet the spectacle was never random. It was leverage. It forced visibility in an industry that often ignores those who do not conform. Shock became the microphone. Message followed the volume. What makes her trajectory distinct is not that she evolved. Most artists evolve. It is that she absorbed criticism, injury, trauma, and cultural backlash without abandoning the core idea that built her platform. Difference deserves amplification. The cancellation of a $160 million tour at 27 exposed fragility. The Oscar at 33 symbolized recognition. But neither moment alone explains her impact. The real shift happened when shock stopped being defense and started becoming dialogue. She did not erase the controversial chapters. She reframed them. The meat dress remains part of her mythology. So does the activism. So does the vulnerability. If spectacle was the doorway, compassion became the foundation. And if outrage once defined the conversation around her, reflection now defines the aftermath. The question is no longer whether she chased attention. The question is whether attention was always a tool, not the goal.